Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Last week, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, the Lord Chancellor, announced a package of measures to address offender management, and I thanked him for his contribution and the proposals that he outlined. And importantly, we spoke then, and I want to speak again today about the whole issue about the removal of foreign national offenders from our country. It is absolutely right that the government does everything it possibly can to remove them, because foreign national offenders are living in the UK, often under visas, and often they use our laws to actually keep them here when they actually have no rights to remain in this country. And they are committing offences, and they are posing a danger to the public. And that breach of public safety, in my view, is a clear right of their right to remain in the UK. There is already a high bar for an offender to be convicted and given a custodial sentence at a threshold that qualifies them for deportation. And certainly during my 3 years as Home Secretary, we did, in fact, the front bench has already referred to this, we deported around 12,000 foreign national offenders. That was despite the pandemic, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and the travel restrictions at the time. And for each FNO deported, our streets and communities become that little bit safer, and that is something we should all be focused on. Those who remain in this country can, and they still pose a risk to safety. And we have sadly seen some come out of our prisons, stay in our communities and commit further dangerous offences and serious crimes. And as the Minister and the front bench know, there are some in this House, and I have to say this quite starkly today, particularly having listened to the opposite, the shadow benches, who have literally campaigned year after year. And in my time as Home Secretary in December 2020, in fact, 70 members of the benches opposite wrote to me to stop a deportation flight to Jamaica, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Murderers, rapists, drug dealers, you name it, were on that flight. And day after day, in fact, ministers from the Home Office would come to this House and do a valiant job in speaking about protecting the public and why these flights had to be removed. And I think it's quite shameful, actually, to hear a level of deniability from the party opposite today. I simply don't think that's at all acceptable. I was lobbied day in, day out, often through the national newspapers, I should add, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but through letters that even the front bench would send me, relentlessly, where they would broadcast their support for criminals, and on social media they'd made the case for murderers, sex offenders to stay in our country and be able to live in our communities. They made human rights claims to enable dangerous criminals to stay in our country. And they have shown more respect, I have to say this, and interest for the rights of these dangerous criminals than the victims or for the public safety of people in our country and the victims. And that is why, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I say this also as a former Home Secretary, that party opposite can never be trusted on law and order issues or on offender management. And I also think their previous track record speaks volumes on this too. And living in the UK is a privilege, and those that come here and break our laws and commit serious offenders should expect to have their rights removed and also their liberty taken away. And this is why we should be unapologetic and robust in our approach to the removal of FNOs. Now, coming to some of the measures that enable some of the measures in this SI that will enable FNOs to be deported directly from prison sooner, at 18 months rather than 12 months. It is vital that offenders are removed from our country, and of course everyone wants to see this happen, the public in particular, and their victims in particular do. And again, I'm afraid, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have spent time in my previous time in government with the victims of some of the most appalling crimes committed to them by FNOs, and they are absolutely, their lives are shattered when they see these individuals not being removed from our country, and in fact then left to be released and then rebuild their lives in our country at the cost of the taxpayer, which is just wrong. So I would like to ask my right honourable friend, the Minister, a series of questions around the practicalities of how this scheme will work, as the change is a significant one and it does have an impact on the punitive and deterrent element of sentencing. And so I'd be welcome if he would give me the details of the consideration that they will give, in particular, to the impact on a victim of the early removal scheme and the earlier 18-month release measure that this brings in. There are many victims who will expect an offender to be in custody for as long as possible to serve a punishment for their crimes, and will have concerns about an offender being released, enjoying freedoms in the country of their nationality. And victims in particular of rape and sexual offences and other serious offences in particular have very, and rightly so, significant concerns about seeing their perpetrators of these horrific crimes effectively receiving a degree of their liberty back. I have a constituent who was a victim of such a crime. Prior to this measure coming in under the current 12-month arrangement, she was concerned that that person who caused her just the most appalling harm could be at liberty, even though no longer in this country. And she made representations to me that the offender should not be allowed to be released early. So I think it would be helpful for the Minister just to speak about the practicalities of this in terms of how these offenders will be managed. Secondly, I'd welcome from the Minister details on the communications that victims will receive. The Victims Bill, as we know, is going through this House at the moment, and it is something that many of us across this House have campaigned for, in my case for almost a decade now. And it gives a welcome focus, and I do support the bill, on supporting the rights of victims in the criminal justice system and getting that rebalancing. And that bill is coming in because of the concern and frustration of victims, and that obviously applies to victims of FNOs. So I hope again that the Minister will provide some assurances and clarity around how victims again will be supported. They do get some communication, but they are heavily re-traumatised, and when they hear any information about the individuals being released from prison and the implications that that may have as well. And that given some offenders will be dangerous and will show no signs of remorse or efforts to rehabilitate, can the Minister explain whether there will still be a process in place to keep dangerous offenders locked up rather than eligible for early release? Fourthly, can the Minister explain how the government will deal with the enforcement of this scheme when an offender, and I'm sorry to say this, makes human rights claims to try to block and frustrate their deportation from the UK, which again brings me back to some of the appeals that I used to receive when I was Home Secretary from the party opposite. In terms of the other measures announced by the Secretary of State, the Lord Chancellor, last week, I would hope that in the summing up the Minister can give further details and assurances, particularly on the offender management package. The proposals, the staffing, I mean, I appreciate the staffing is asking for specific information, but actually the implications of this in terms of the overall management. This statutory instrument is, of course, part of a wider package, and we're not discussing that entire package today. But, of course, the front bench and the Minister will know my concerns of the possibility of what we could see, which is effectively what happened under early release schemes of the last Labour government, where offenders actually committed crimes and absconded, and that had serious concerns and implications around public safety. So I'm looking for reassurance this afternoon, please, from the Minister about how the government's approach is going to differ from previous schemes in this area, and also how victims in particular will feel that justice is done and that there is a solid effort to reduce reoffending and the causes of reoffending.